on stage. So I'm here today with Ramez Naam, who is a computer scientist, a futurist, a speaker, and the award-winning author of the recently released Apex, which is the third installment in the Nexus series, which is awesome. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And Cory, Doctorow, who is the co-editor of Boing Boing, the head of EFF's Apollo 1201 project, which you heard about earlier. And he's also, in his spare time, published 9 novels, fictionally.
Well, more than that.
Fiction, right?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's 22 books.
22 books.
Most of them fiction.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so sorry. I didn't mean to undersell you.
No, that's fair enough.
Both are pretty outstanding members of the Science Fiction and Technology Justice League. And we are here today to give you all a sneak peek into what might be coming in 20 years from now. So that would be 2035. We've spent a lot of time this week talking about recent scientific discoveries, near-term predictions, and we wanted to really get out ahead of the curve and get into that. So Cory, Mez, let's imagine it's 2024. The automation revolution has eliminated a dramatic number of jobs, and the political climate has changed such that lawmakers have actually passed a universal basic income. Are we actually seeing a second enlightenment because of this?
Well, let's talk about how we get there. Let's talk about automation and job loss. You all have heard about the Google self-driving car, right? So the Google self-driving car, you probably don't know how awesome it is in terms of impact on the world. About 3,000 people die per day in car crashes around the world. The self-driving car could probably eliminate most of that. It would save fuel efficiency, it would save carbon emissions, cut the cost of transport. About 3 million people in the US work driving a car as a living. 1% of the US, 2% of the US workforce. So if automation moves fast, looks like it will, they will lose their jobs. About 1 million people a week change jobs in the US, so it's maybe not a gigantic number. But if all the self-driving cars, all the driving jobs are gone.
I mean, add in all of the jobs that are lost illegal, personal assistants,
yeah. So
HR.
There's this large societal surplus and this concentrated damage to job function after job function after job function. So we don't know if humanity can keep up. I think that there's some reason to be hopeful, but we may very well need something like a basic income.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a case to be made that automation generally is good for the human race and a force for kind of justice, right? There's no justice in the fact that all of us use toilets and only some of us have to clean them. But if all of our toilets start cleaning themselves and all the people who used to clean toilets for a living now have no source of income, this is not only a problem in terms of fundamental justice, it's also a problem in terms of getting the money to buy self-driving toilet or self-cleaning toilets.
Self-driving toilets would be fun, though.
Well, I mean, I think we can probably assume that if we have self-driving cars, they will have some mechanism for elimination in them too. Eventually, if all the benefits of automation accrue to the people who own the automation systems, we run out of people who have the money to buy the fruits of those automation systems, right? There needs to be some redistributive mechanism, or there needs to be some sector that arises that derives income not from capital expenditure, but from labor. Otherwise, you don't have anyone to sell robot manufactured goods to. And so presumably we reach some crisis, and presumably that crisis is resolved. There are some interesting labor-intensive technologies that we don't deploy very often that have some interesting characteristics in terms of their overall environmental impact. Yesterday we had a workshop on water use, and one of the subjects that came up was permaculture. And permaculture, agricultural techniques require a lot of human thought and labor and intervention relative to mass agricultural stuff, but they're also extremely energy efficient, extremely water efficient, and extremely carbon efficient. Maybe we divert some of the labor to there, but that also seems it's likely to be automatable. And so I think that if you want to predict a crisis arising between now and 2025, it would be that crisis of what we do about the doctrinal reluctance to do redistribution as against the need to have some mechanism by which a consumer class can consume the benefits of productivity gains through automation.
So let's, okay, we've gotten to this point where there are a lot of jobs lost. Everyone's, kind of trying to figure out what to do. And we eventually make the decision as a country in some way that it's time to become Denmark. We need a universal basic income. What does that actually mean for our lives going forward, and what opportunities does that?
I think it's potentially a very good thing. If you look at examples around the world where we've given people just a flat sum of money, period. This experiment's been done places in the US, places in Europe, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a huge uplift to these people. And one of the most interesting things is these unconditional cash transfers. If you look at studies in sub-Saharan Africa, what you find is that people didn't get lazy. Their income rose by a substantial amount in addition to that, because it allowed them to deal with necessities or invest in their education or do other things. So I think we will keep creating new job niches that people can move into, but people are most able to move into a high intellectual job area if they had a decent childhood where they were not in poverty, where they had the luxury to go and learn about things and so on.
Well, if they're not in precarity. But it raises this interesting question, which is, what do we need price discovery for things that are fully automatable and thus intrinsically abundant? Are there natural prices to be discovered in things that are truly abundant, right? Machines that don't wear out, software. They do have upfront costs, but historically, price discovery is not about recouping upfront costs. In fact, intrinsic to the theory of disruption is that you get overinvestment, crashes, and what happens is the investor community eats the cost of R&D. I mean, that's what happened with fiber, right? You build out lots more fiber than you could possibly need because the animal spirits motivate you to overinvest in fiber. Everybody loses their shirt.
They speak to me too sometimes.
That's right. And someone then buys that fiber at 10 cents on the dollar, and that's the people who can profitably operate it. So neither markets nor non-market mechanisms require that there be recouping for the upfront cost. And so really, it's about operational and marginal cost. And when operational and marginal costs fall precipitously, which is the promise of automation, productivity gains through automation, why do we need price discovery? In other words, why do we need prices? Why do we need income, right? If things are genuinely abundant, what are the prices? What function does the price serve?
To me, the price serves creating an incentive for further innovation that makes things even better. Right? Keynes, great economist of the 20th century, predicted that by now we'd all be working 10-hour work weeks because things were so abundant. It turns out there's actually more stuff we would like, and some of it actually adds value. And so creating the incentive for the innovation to come up with more of that, I think I would rather have a basic income going to people so that everybody can afford the basic necessities of life than just give it away free for everyone without the basic income.
So there's an argument about redistribution and the equality of income and wealth that goes that dollar-a-day poverty isn't what it used to be, right? Dollar-a-day poverty used to be a lot more grinding than it is in an era of hygiene, vaccination, green revolution crops, and IT, where people who have marginal existences can find better marketplaces for their goods and so on. And so what you end up with is that being very poor is not as bad as it once was, right? Being in what the UN calls least developed nation status is not as bad as it once was.
Are you thinking back to like the plague era here? Or?
No, I'm thinking back to the interwar and post-war era, immediate post-war era. When the dollar a day equivalent, it's been adjusted for inflation. When the UN first set its least developed nations classification, the lifespan, the material wealth, the mental and physical health of people who were living in least developed nations conditions were substantially worse than they are today, right? The number of people in least developed nations changes up and down, and what we call least developed nation changes up and down, but with an equivalent cash input, you get much more material output because of technology, right? Well, as that cost continues to fall, what do you need?
So you're saying it'll be much easier to give people what they need to survive.
Sure, and then you end up with different problems with inequality. So like a characteristic problem of inequality is the lack of the pursuit of evidence-based policy. So if you look at a very unequal state like Saudi Arabia, right? It's really clear that it's not good for Saudi Arabia's national wealth to exclude 52% of the population from civic life, right? There are engineers who could be doing work in Saudi, or women who could become engineers who could do work in Saudi Arabia that would be the next Apple or the next desalination or the next some other major game-changing technology. By keeping 52% of Saudi Arabia's population out of the workforce, they do themselves a disservice. But because the wealth is so unequally distributed, the biases of a small elite are able to trump what's obvious evidence-based conclusions. We have microcosms of that in other
Luckily,
domains.
that doesn't happen here in the
Yeah,
US.
I mean, you know, climate denial is
Right.
another example. And,
Yeah, no, that's actually a good segue. So Elon Musk recently, moving on to the next scenario. Elon Musk recently had an interview with a Danish interviewer, and in which he said, he was asked about what he thinks self-driving cars will be like in 20 years. And his response was, I hope civilization is still around in 20 years. So he was referring, of course, to climate change. And The Guardian recently reported that on the math of all the commitments leading up to the Paris summit, in the best case scenario, they would get us to 2.7 degrees Celsius rise globally. Assuming no one pulls a Volkswagen, we're still in danger of 3 to 4 degree global temperature increases, which is going to put us in pretty bad territory. What events or forces are going to will keep countries from reaching those targets?
Well, I love Elon, but I don't think we should characterize climate change as potentially ending civilization in 20 years. I think that's not accurate and also not productive. It actually hampers political progress on it. People who hear that message harden their hearts and don't want to work on it. What climate change will do in 20 years is make life increasingly bad for the poorest people on Earth. So if you live in Bangladesh or sub-Saharan Africa, if the rains fail, you don't have irrigation. You depend on rainfall for your crops, right? So it creates potentially huge havoc, and even the DoD says this is a driver of state failure, a driver of future US force deployment, lots of nastiness. I am optimistic we can turn the corner, but we're not there yet. We're starting to turn the car, but the car is still headed for the cliff, and we have to keep turning that. What's happening in tech is solar. 30 years ago, solar cost $77 per watt.
So would you say that Elon Musk will keep countries from reaching their targets? Pessimism.
No, I don't think Elon Musk will, but with all due respect, I think Naomi Klein actually makes it harder to get political progress in the US on this topic. The same memes that get people on the left really engaged, and I'm a liberal, the same memes that get people who are liberals really engaged and really passionate, actually in poll after poll, they harden opposition from conservatives. The messages about climate change that do best with conservatives and that swing belief in climate change by 30 points are about innovation, about technology, about new business opportunities, about risk rather than doom. Pessimistic messages actually do terribly, unfortunately. And I do think there's some reason for optimism. Solar has plunged in price about 150x for the cost of a solar module. In the US, grid electricity costs about 7 cents to build a new natural gas plant. The cheapest solar deal in the US was 3.9 cents this year. And even if you back out all the subsidies, it's about 6 cents. So we have this exponential price decline. Even big banks like UBS is saying renewables are now deflationary to energy prices. It's an amazing thing. Batteries, you saw red flow here. The price of lithium-ion batteries has dropped by about a factor of 10 to 20 in the last 15 years. And another 10, 15 years, they'll be cheap enough we can have grid electricity from renewables indefinitely. But there's a huge amount of infrastructure to be built. It's going to be a multi-trillion-dollar investment. We still have to solve issues like deforestation, like methane coming out of cows. We have more than 1 billion cars on the road that have internal combustion engines, probably 2 billion by the time EVs are really taking more than half of the market. And so there's a very large thing to overcome. I think with race to extinction, I think race is exactly the right way to put this. It's a race between how fast we're outputting greenhouse gases and causing damage and how fast we can innovate. And they're perilously close to neck and neck right now.
So I think that the important thing to look to is not whether there'll be crises, but what we do about them. Because we know that there will be crises, right? We're already far gone enough in the story of the environment to know that crises will arise.
Right.
That through these shocks, tsunamis and huge temperature changes, water shortages, and so on. And the thing that will determine how we pull through isn't just technology, it's our theory about what we should do during crisis. There's this wonderful writer named Rebecca Solnit who wrote a book that swept all the literary prizes in 2013 called A Paradise Built in Hell, where she talks about people's firsthand accounts of people's behavior during great historic crises, starting with the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, but also Haiti and Katrina and many others. And one of the things that she emphasizes is that the stories that we tell each other about how people behaved in those crises are actually not borne out by firsthand contemporaneous accounts from within the crisis.
Right, people tend to respond very well. They actually
That's right.
rise to the
They
occasion
take care of each other.
And,
yeah. And she points out that there's no such thing as a natural disaster, right? Nature doesn't care whether it sterilizes itself. You know, the microorganisms that sterilize this planet by emitting oxygen as a waste product and creating an oxygen-rich environment that we now inhabit, that was not a natural disaster. That was just nature, right? It's only a disaster if someone cares about what happens, if it hurts a person, and whether it hurts a person is based on what choices a person has made, where they live and how they live there. And so I think that we have two forces, social forces, that will be really dispositive in how we weather, literally, the changes that are coming. One is what we think our neighbors will do in a crisis. If you believe that when the lights go out, your neighbors are coming over to eat you, the correct thing to do is to have a shotgun in your shelter. If you believe that when the lights go out, your neighbors are coming over to share their food, the right thing to do is to bring them a covered dish, right? And in crisis, people who work together resolve crisis more quickly than people who work across interests. This is kind of self-evident. And science fiction has been enormously harmful in the way that it tells crisis stories, right? And particularly in films, but also in novels. There is this cheap, easy drama that you get by having the lights go out and then the streets filled with rioters. And you know, when you look at even the Brooklyn riots during the power outages in the 1970s, they were small, they were localized, they were extensions of existing problems that had to do with gross injustice, and they were offset by these incredible stories of people going, well, my freezer has gone off, let's barbecue everything in it and invite the neighbors over. Over and over again, that's the story that you hear from the ground, but it's not the story that we remember. So that's the first story that we're going to have to change, right? If we can change the story about how we deal with crisis, we will be better situated to deal with crisis. But the other one is about what abundance and luxury is, right? We have this thesis now that abundance is whatever you want, you can get as much as you can afford of it. And there's another version of abundance, which is whatever is presently abundant, you can have as much as you want of it. And so I live in Burbank, where in July, it was technically as hot as balls. And the sun never stopped shining. And people with solar panels on their roofs could leave their doors open and run their air conditioners full bore and still have power to spare, right? We have a historic idea of jubilee, right? In earlier times before technological intervention or with different technological interventions, there would be times of great abundance, harvest times and so on. And in those times, we had festivals, right? When the white nights are a really good example of this. When the sun is up, before electric light was common, when the sun was up all night or till very late in the night in northern latitudes, it was a time to exempt yourself from work and to have these days-long festivals in which people sort of relaxed in these cool, sunny evenings. I actually met my wife on Midsummer's Eve in Helsinki at a Nokia event. We stayed up all night on the roof of a hotel in its bar, drinking and you know, falling in love, right? Because there's something magic about these white nights. If we adjust what our version of abundance is, if we adjust what our version of luxury is, so that it's not a hair shirt to say that you're not importing something from somewhere very far away or growing something in the most energy-intensive way. If instead of relying on positional goods, where you demonstrate your relative economic position by buying things that are intentionally difficult or expensive, and instead we emphasize real Sybarism, like real lavish, luxurious life, that is keyed to the rhythms of what our technology can deliver in abundance, we will radically transform the way that we consume our resources.
I want to go on record as being pro-Sybarism.
Yeah.
Let me just riff off of what Cory said very briefly. So that thing about, are your neighbors going to come to eat you or are they going to bring you a dish, also applies at the level of nations, right? And so solving a challenge like climate change requires that cooperation of nations. So if your attitude about geopolitics is zero-sum or negative-sum, you're going to believe that, well, we shouldn't do anything because China's not. But actually, people respond to tit for tat. So one of the reasons it's so vital for the US to show leadership is to change the conversation so that other nations get on board. And actually, China is doing more about climate change now than we are. And then the second thing is I also want to stress, I know that there's some ardent capitalists here, and I'm an ardent capitalist myself, though I think it needs some changes, is that there are fortunes to be made in this multi-trillion-dollar transition. Elon Musk has 2 of them, at least. With Solar City, he just invented a new business model idea. Hey, people don't have the money to pay for solar on their roof out of pocket. Let's finance it. $5 billion market cap with basically nothing but that idea, right? And with Tesla...
Batteries.
Yeah, Tesla...
We have people here who are working on batteries.
Yeah, we do indeed. And with Tesla, $40 billion market cap, that's a real tech investment. But there are fortunes, vast fortunes to be made in this area as well.
What are some of the other areas of fortune that...
Well, I think energy storage is going to be a very big one, and there's a very big energy storage race. I am big on business models. What can you do that really just takes the thing that should happen and aligns the incentives for individuals? I'll give you an example. Solar City just said, hey, it's actually cheaper for a person in the long run if they have solar on their rooftop, but the incentives aren't aligned. They don't have the money in their pocket. Let's solve that. There's a company called Spark that's doing that for energy efficiency. Hey, we'll finance the efficiency change for this building and even connect you to the realtors and so on. They'll make a profit, energy goes down, the building owner makes a profit. In Africa, we had the head of a mobile banking group up here. The biggest problem in Africa we see people burn kerosene in their homes. It's a fire hazard, it causes respiratory distress, and in some places in sub-Saharan Africa, people spend 3/4 of their family income on energy. So solar has a payback time of about 9 months in sub-Saharan Africa. People don't have cash, they don't have banking. Okay, they've got a mobile phone, can we bank them that way? And then that can be used to pay for this solar, and it saves everybody money and makes people money at the same time.
I'm really interested in Champerty, which is financing other people's lawsuits. So we live in an era characterized by what an economist would call corruption. And corruption isn't like just a pejorative term. It's when there's an outcome that's not supported by evidence, whose benefits are concentrated in the hands of a small number of people, and whose costs are diffused across a wider society. And the people who receive those benefits, I pump my effluent into the river that we all drink from, I realize a huge profit in the form of lower production costs from not treating my waste. I can use some of that to lobby against anything that can be done to make me treat my waste. Everyone else has to pay for water filters and health costs, but those costs are widely diffused, and they don't have a way of ganging it back up again. So imagine a Kickstarter for reverse lawsuits, reverse class action suits. You may have seen a classic corruption was with the song Happy Birthday. Happy Birthday was claimed to be owned by Warner Chappell Music. It wasn't. Any legal scholar who'd looked into the copyright history saw that there was no way that it was still in copyright, but the licenses that they charged for were much cheaper than litigating the question. Finally, it was litigated this month because a documentary film company raised some money to do a documentary about litigating the question. But imagine if you had a Kickstarter where whenever anyone was paying Danegeld to patent trolls, to copyright trolls, or whenever anyone was bearing a cost that was diffused across multiple people whose benefits were concentrated into a small sector, you could say, when X number of my colleagues all agree that they will stop paying the Danegeld, I will too. And you have a reverse auction mechanism for lawyers to strip companies that have extracted enormous amounts of wealth, right? Like, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. Why do you sue giant firms that have used corruption to make themselves the largest, best financed firms in the world? Because when you win, you get to take all of that money from them, right? That's where the money is, right? So using Champerty, using Kickstarters for organizing collective action around diffused costs to act as a countervailing force for corruption isn't just a way to return huge amounts of money to the investors who make those bets. It's also a way to reduce corruption, right? To make it such that we follow evidence-based policy instead of pursuing policy that is in the self-interest of small numbers of people. And if I was going to fund this, I would start with organizing people who are in private prisons. because that industry has got a lot of money, deep pockets. The lack of evidence in the way that private prisons have been run is obvious on its face to anyone who's glanced at it in the most cursory way. And the material cost to those people who've been incarcerated in private prisons are so grotesque and so obvious and so easy to demonstrate in a court of law that you could take them to the cleaners. And all of those, Corrections Corporation of America and so on, when they die, it's like Camus, pour encourager les autres, right? When they go under, every other company that's contemplating that business model is suddenly going to want to audit its practices because their investors are going to be talking to the board, talking to the management team about what their practices are and what their strategy is for when the next one of these big suits comes after them. And it would be a service to the public and also a way to get very, very rich.
So Cory, are you, in the spirit of Creative Commons, are you planning on implementing this idea?
I've talked to some people in third parties who want to implement it for votes, because the problem with third parties is that you throw away your vote unless you know enough of your neighbors are willing to do it. And the idea is that when you knock on the door and say, throw away your vote for me, you say, don't throw away your vote for me, pledge that you'll vote for me if enough of your neighbors pledge it.
And Canada is going through something similar
That's right,
right
Canada,
now
where
with the split
I'm
between...
from, but not allowed to vote anymore. Yeah.
So I think we have time for
a question?
one or two questions, yeah.
I don't want to ask a question as much as make a statement.
If you add, what do you think of that to the end of it, it becomes a question.
And it has to do with the response of the panel on climate change. And you had a wonderful example about sharing, but the developed nations have abundance. The non-developed nations don't have abundance. And as this is happening, as the Nile Delta floods and they can't grow crops, Mekong Delta floods, they can't grow crops, the scenes in the mountains are in trouble, infestation is occurring across the planet. There needs to be some thought about, it's about money, no, it's about war will break out, we'll live in a Mad Max movie unless we deal with adaptation to climate change while we argue about mitigation. And I just wanted to make that suggestion.
I think that's absolutely right. So I gave a talk at DARPA about a year ago where I was arguing that a key thing they should be looking at with biotech, for instance, is help crops survive in a hotter world as a way to cut US military expenditures. But there is an equity issue, and the developed nations do have to do more. And there are examples of that with this thing called RED, reduced emissions through decreased deforestation, where rich countries are paying lower income countries like Brazil and Indonesia about $1 billion a year now to reduce deforestation. So we need much more of that.
And the developing world does have an abundance of some things like sunshine, wind, and young workforces. As we heard yesterday, the demographics are not with the developed world, and combined with the kind of horrific xenophobia. You know, Big Hero 6 was a great movie, but it's fundamentally about the fact that the Japanese would rather have robots wiping their parents' asses than Filipinos.
Jason?
Maybe just a...
I missed that scene.
You know, robots, Filipinos. Just kind of a fun one, and hopefully a quick one, is we have technologies that we expect will spark ethical debate, cloning, things like that going forward. What are the things that, for each of you, in your view, we're not thinking about in ethical terms that will become ethical dilemmas for us in 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think this job automation, we're starting to think about it. But I think that the debates about biotech and ethics, those just go away, they get normalized. Nobody talks about test tube babies anymore.
Yeah.
I think the things about automation and inequality and how to distribute it, we are starting to talk about it, but we're not getting down to brass tacks yet.
So you're saying you think biotech isn't an issue?
Biotech, people get squicked early on, and 20 years later, they're totally cool with it once it's helped replace their knee or help them have a baby. People, again and again and again, from transfusions to organ transplants to the smallpox vaccine to IVF, the issues about biotech just go away once people get used to it.
But what happens when you get into more like genetic augmentation?
That'll go away too. Nobody will really care. It's much harder than you think, but that will go away as an ethical debate over time, except for potentially the equality issue. I'll give you IVF.
I think that is the ethical
So
debate.
here's an inequality issue as it relates to that. IVF, in the US, about 1% of kids born were conceived via in vitro fertilization. In the Netherlands, or let's say Finland, it's about 4 or 5%. Why? Because Finland subsidizes it and the US doesn't. So if you can't have kids in Finland and you want to, the government pays for that therapy. So that's the inequality issue of a high-cost procedure.
And we're out of time, but I'll say very briefly, I think that adversarial computing is dreadfully underappreciated today and will become a major crisis tomorrow. The idea that our devices are designed with the design specification that their owners are adverse to the interests of the device. And so, the John Deere tractor example is one. If the farmer can change his tractor, then the farmer can extract information at the expense of John Deere. And so we have devices that are designed deliberately to obscure what they're doing from their owners. And what that means is that when flaws emerge in those devices, and they all have flaws, that's the halting state problem, when flaws emerge in those devices, they can be exploited with malware that can run in a system that is designed to prevent its owner from knowing what it's doing. Right? Your phone is a supercomputer in your pocket that knows who all your friends are and has a camera and a microphone and knows everything that you talk about and all the places you go. And it's against the law to tell you how it works. And it has a mode where it runs code that you're not allowed to see and is supposed to obscure what it's doing from you so that you don't switch stores, app stores. And when spies or when crooks or when griefers get into that protected mode, they're able to operate with impunity in a way that confounds all of our ideas about security. And I think we're going to have terrible breaches, automated breaches, that are targets of opportunity breaches, where they just take 1 million people and grab footage from their Nest cameras, analyze it programmatically for nudity, and dump it all onto the internet. And that's going to really make people aware of what happens when your device is designed to treat you as its enemy.
Cool. Thanks.
So on that cheery note, we're out of time.